The fluorescent lights in the basement hummed the same tired tune they'd been humming for 15 years. David sat at his metal desk, surrounded by cardboard boxes that smelled like old paper and forgotten time. This was his world. 4 concrete walls, no windows, and rows of shelves packed with artifacts that nobody wanted to see. Most people who worked at the museum didn't even know his name. They'd pass him in the hallway and look right through him, like he was just another dusty relic that belonged in storage. At department meetings, when he tried to speak up, conversations would somehow shift to another topic. His ideas floated away like smoke, never quite landing anywhere that mattered. David was an archivist. That's what his job title said anyway. But really, he was the guy who sorted through donations that other curators had already rejected, old coins that weren't rare enough, pottery shards from common periods, documents in languages that seemed too obscure to matter. Everything that ended up in his basement was there because someone upstairs had decided it wasn't worth their time. He'd been doing this work since he was 23 years old. Started as a simple assistant, moving boxes and filing paperwork. No fancy college degree, no letters after his name. Just a kid from a working-class neighborhood who loved history and needed a job. Over the years, he'd worked his way up to senior archivist, but that didn't mean much. Senior just meant he'd been invisible longer than anyone else. The funny thing was, David didn't mind the solitude. While everyone else fought for recognition upstairs, he had something they didn't. Time. Hours and hours of uninterrupted time with objects that held secrets nobody else cared to unlock, and he'd used every minute of it. Every evening after his official shift ended at 5, David stayed late. He'd pull out his notebooks and get to work on his real education. He taught himself languages, not the popular ones that might get you a promotion, but the ancient ones. The dead languages that archaeologists stumbled over. He learned to read symbols that hadn't been spoken aloud in thousands of years. He studied pottery techniques, dating methods, and artifact preservation. He memorized the trade routes of civilizations that had crumbled to dust long before anyone alive was born. His tiny apartment looked like a scholar's library had exploded inside it. Books stacked on every surface, notes taped to walls, photographs of artifacts pinned up like a detective's murder board. His friends had stopped inviting him out years ago. They'd say things like, "You're wasting your life in that basement," or, "When are you going to do something real?" They didn't understand that he was doing something real. He was building himself into someone who knew things that experts didn't. The museum had a small staff cafeteria where everyone ate lunch. David tried eating there during his first few years. He'd sit at whatever table had an empty chair and try to join the conversation. But the talk was always about politics within the museum, about who got which grant, about whose research was getting published. When he'd mention something interesting he'd found in the archives, people would nod politely and change the subject. After a while, he started eating lunch at his desk. It was easier that way, less painful than being reminded that he didn't belong to their world. He was the basement guy, the filing clerk, the nobody who handled the things nobody wanted. His supervisor, a woman named Patricia who worked on the floor above him, would check in maybe once a month. She'd poke her head into the basement, ask if everything was running smoothly, and leave before he could answer. She'd been his supervisor for 8 years, and he wasn't sure she could pick him out of a lineup. The younger curators were the worst. Fresh out of graduate school with their fancy degrees and published theses, they'd strut past his desk, carrying boxes to storage like they were doing him a favor. One time, a new hire actually asked him where the real researchers worked. David had pointed upstairs, and the guy had laughed like it was a joke they were sharing. But David kept his head down and his mouth shut. He cataloged every item that came through with meticulous care. He created detailed records that no one read. He made connections between artifacts that no one asked about. And late at night, when the museum was empty except for the security guard doing rounds, he continued his education in the dim light of his desk lamp. He'd developed a routine over the years. Monday nights were for Sumerian cuneiform. Tuesdays he focused on ancient Egyptian hieratic script. Wednesdays were reserved for studying archaeological methodologies. Thursdays he worked on translation exercises. Fridays he tested himself, trying to decode real inscriptions from photographs he'd taken in the museum's collection. Weekends were for whatever had captured his curiosity that week. The security guard, an older man named Frank, was probably the only person in the building who actually talked to David like a human being. Frank would stop by around 9 at night during his rounds and they'd chat for a few minutes. Frank never asked why David stayed so late. Maybe he figured David didn't have anywhere better to be. Maybe he was right. There were moments when David wondered if he was fooling himself. Maybe the people upstairs were right to ignore him. Maybe he was just a filing clerk playing pretend scholar. Maybe all those hours studying were just a way to avoid admitting his life hadn't turned out the way he'd hoped. But then he'd stumble across something in the archives that made his heart race. A tablet with unusual markings. A coin from a period that didn't match its supposed origin. A document that contradicted accepted historical timelines. And he'd spend days researching, cross-referencing, and building theories that no one would ever hear. Those moments made everything worthwhile. The academic world had never noticed him, and he'd convinced himself that was fine. He didn't need recognition. He didn't need his name on papers or invitations to conferences. He just needed his books, his artifacts, and his quiet corner of the basement where he could keep learning. That's what he told himself anyway. That he didn't care. That he'd made peace with being invisible. That his work was enough even if no one else ever saw it. He'd been telling himself that lie for 15 years. And then everything changed on a Tuesday afternoon in March, when the email came through about a special lecture. A famous archaeologist was visiting the museum. Someone whose name everyone knew. Someone whose discoveries got written about in newspapers and magazines. Someone who represented everything David had never become. The lecture was open to all museum staff. David almost didn't go. What was the point? He'd sit in the back, listen to someone brilliant talk about brilliant things, and then return to his basement. But something made him decide to attend. Maybe curiosity. Maybe loneliness. Maybe just the desire to remember what it felt like to be in a room full of people who cared about the same things he did. He had no idea that this decision would completely shatter the careful, quiet life he'd built for himself in the shadows. He had no idea that in just a few hours the world would finally see what he'd spent 15 years becoming. But first, he had to walk into that lecture hall and do something he hadn't done in a very long time. He had to make himself visible. The lecture hall was already packed when David arrived. He'd never seen so many people gathered in one room at the museum. Curators, researchers, graduate students, even the director had shown up. Everyone wanted to see Dr. Catherine Wells in person. She was a legend in the field, the kind of archaeologist who made discoveries that changed textbooks, the kind of person who got interviewed on television and quoted in newspapers. David slipped into a seat in the very back row, hoping no one would notice him. A few people glanced his way, but their eyes passed over him without recognition. Same as always. He was wearing his usual work clothes, simple khakis and a button-up shirt that had seen better days. Everyone else looked polished and professional. He felt like a kid who'd wandered into the wrong classroom. The lights dimmed and Dr. Wells walked onto the stage. She was in her late 50s with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She commanded attention just by standing there. When she spoke, her voice filled the room with easy confidence. She talked about her latest expedition to a remote archaeological site in Central Asia. The images on the screen behind her showed ruins buried in desert sand, artifacts carefully extracted from ancient earth, and her team working under brutal sun. The audience was captivated. David found himself leaning forward, absorbed in every word. Then Dr. Wells showed a photograph that made the entire room gasp. It was a stone tablet about 2 feet tall and covered in intricate symbols. The markings were unlike anything David had ever seen in textbooks, and he'd seen plenty. They seemed to blend different writing systems together in a way that looked almost impossible. "This artifact has stumped every expert I've consulted," Dr. Wells said, her voice carrying a hint of frustration. "I've sent photographs to colleagues around the world. Linguists, historians, specialists in ancient scripts. No one can decode it. The symbols appear to be a hybrid of at least 3 different writing systems, but the combination makes no logical sense." She paused, looking out at the audience. "So I'm issuing an open challenge to anyone in this building. Anyone. If you can decode this inscription and provide a methodology that holds up under scrutiny, I will personally endorse your career. I'll co-author a paper with you. I'll recommend you to any institution you choose. I'll open doors that normally take decades to unlock." The room buzzed with excited whispers. Several senior researchers exchanged glances, probably already planning their attempts. David felt his heart pounding in his chest. He'd been studying exactly this kind of problem for years. Those hours spent learning obscure languages and analyzing hybrid scripts, they'd all been preparing him for something like this. But who was he to think he could solve what the world's experts couldn't? He was nobody. A basement archivist with no credentials, no published work, no reputation. The logical part of his brain told him to stay quiet, to not embarrass himself in front of everyone who'd spent years ignoring him. Dr. Wells continued, "I'm not naive. I suspect this inscription may be impossible to decode. We may lack the necessary context or reference materials, but I believe in giving every possibility a chance. So if anyone thinks they can crack this puzzle, come see me after the lecture." She smiled, but there was challenge in that smile. It said she didn't expect anyone to succeed. It said she'd seen confident people fail before. It said this was more a demonstration of the problem's difficulty than a real invitation. The lecture continued for another 30 minutes, but David barely heard any of it. His mind was racing, analyzing what he'd seen. Those symbols on the tablet, they reminded him of something, a pattern he'd noticed years ago while cataloging a collection of pottery shards from 3 different regions. He'd spent weeks researching the connection, building theories that no one had asked for. Could that research actually apply here? When the lecture ended, people swarmed toward the stage. Senior researchers wanting to network with Dr. Wells. Graduate students hoping for a moment of her attention. David hung back, still sitting in his seat. What was he thinking? That he could just walk up there and announce he wanted to try? They'd laugh him out of the room, but something stronger than fear was pushing him forward. Maybe it was 15 years of being invisible. Maybe it was knowing he'd spent countless nights preparing for exactly this kind of challenge. Maybe it was just exhaustion from hiding what he knew. Whatever it was, David found himself standing up and walking toward the stage. The crowd around Dr. Wells was thinning out. A few people were still talking to her, asking questions about her expedition. David waited at the edge, his hands shaking slightly. He shoved them in his pockets so no one would notice. A woman next to him, one of the senior curators, glanced at him with confusion. "Can I help you find someone?" she asked, like he must be lost. "I'm waiting to speak with Dr. Wells," David said quietly. The woman's eyebrows went up. "Oh, are you from another institution?" "No, I work here." "In the archives?" She looked at him like he'd just said he was the janitor wanting to discuss quantum physics. "I see," she said in a tone that meant she didn't see at all. Then she turned away, dismissing him. Finally, the last person finished talking to Dr. Wells. She was gathering her notes, probably ready to leave. David took a breath and stepped forward. His voice came out smaller than he'd intended. "Dr. Wells?" She looked up, her expression polite but tired. "Yes? My name is David. I work in the archives here. I'd like to attempt to decode the inscription." For a moment, she just stared at him. Then her assistant, a young man with expensive glasses, let out a short laugh. "The archives? You mean like filing and storage?" David felt heat rise to his face, but he kept his eyes on Dr. Wells. "Yes, I've been studying ancient languages and hybrid scripts for 15 years. I believe I might have a methodology that could work." Dr. Wells studied him with those sharp eyes. He couldn't tell what she was thinking. Around them, a few people had stopped to watch. Someone whispered something, and he heard another person snicker. This was a mistake. He should leave before he humiliated himself further. But then Dr. Wells did something unexpected. She nodded slowly. "All right. Come to my temporary office tomorrow morning. 9 o'clock. I'll give you access to high-resolution photographs of the artifact and all the research materials I have." Her assistant looked shocked. "Dr. Wells, with respect, we have actual linguists who want to attempt this. People with PhDs and published research. And they're welcome to try," Dr. Wells said calmly. "But I made an open challenge to anyone in this building. This gentleman works in this building, therefore he gets his chance." She turned back to David. "I'm giving you 1 week. That's more than generous. Bring me a translation and a detailed explanation of your methodology. If it's legitimate, we'll talk about next steps. If it's not," she shrugged. "Well, then at least you tried." David could barely believe what he was hearing. 1 week, yes, thank you. I won't waste your time." "See that you don't," she said, not unkindly. Then she handed him a business card with her contact information. 9 o'clock tomorrow. Don't be late." As David walked out of the lecture hall, he heard the whispers starting behind him. People wondering who he was, what he was thinking, why Dr. Wells would waste time on someone like him. One person said this should be entertaining, and others laughed in agreement. David didn't care. He had 1 week to do what the world's experts couldn't. 1 week to prove that 15 years in the basement hadn't been wasted. 1 week to show everyone who'd looked through him that he was worth seeing. He practically ran back to his apartment, his mind already working through the problem. He had 7 days to change his entire life. 7 days to step out of the shadows. The clock was ticking and David had never felt more awake. David didn't sleep that first night. He couldn't. His apartment had transformed into something between a research lab and a war room. Every surface was covered with printed photographs of the tablet, reference books pulled from his personal collection, and sheets of paper filled with notes and diagrams. His walls had become a canvas of sticky notes, each one holding a fragment of an idea or a connection he didn't want to forget. The next morning at 9, he'd met with Dr. Wells as promised. She'd handed him a USB drive containing high-resolution images of the artifact from every angle, along with digital files of all previous attempts to decode it. Her assistant had been there too, watching David with barely concealed amusement, like this was all some kind of joke that would play itself out soon enough. 1 week, Dr. Wells had reminded him. If you need clarification on anything, you have my email. Good luck, David. Now it was day 3 and David felt like he was losing his mind. He'd called in sick to work, something he never did. His phone was turned off. He'd stopped answering his door when neighbors knocked to complain about his lights being on at all hours. There was nothing in his world except those symbols and the desperate need to understand them. The problem was more complex than he'd imagined. The tablet contained what looked like 3 different ancient writing systems layered together. On the surface, there was a script that resembled ancient Sumerian cuneiform, but woven between those symbols were marks that looked Egyptian, and underneath it all was something else entirely, something he couldn't immediately place. Every expert who'd tried to decode it had approached it the same way. They'd attempted to read each script separately, trying to find meaning in one layer at a time. David had spent the first 2 days trying that approach too, and he'd failed just like everyone else. The translations came out as nonsense, random words that didn't connect into sentences, ideas that led nowhere. By the 3rd night, David was sitting on his floor surrounded by scattered papers, eating cold pizza and questioning everything. Maybe he wasn't as smart as he thought. Maybe those 15 years of self-education had just been a way to feel important while staying irrelevant. Maybe the people who looked through him every day were right to do so. He picked up one of the photographs, staring at it until his eyes hurt. There had to be something everyone was missing, some key that would unlock the whole thing. He thought about the pottery shards he'd studied years ago, the ones that had first made him notice how different cultures sometimes merged their writing systems when they traded or conquered each other. That's when it hit him. What if these weren't 3 separate scripts? What if they were meant to be read together, as one unified system? What if the tablet wasn't written in 3 languages, but in one new language that combined elements from 3 sources? David's hand started shaking as he grabbed a fresh sheet of paper. He began mapping out the symbols again, but this time looking for patterns in how they interacted with each other. He noticed that certain Sumerian symbols only appeared next to specific Egyptian marks. That couldn't be random. It had to mean something. Hours blurred together. He made coffee and forgot to drink it. He started writing notes on his arms when he ran out of paper. His back ached from sitting hunched over his makeshift desk. None of it mattered. He was onto something. He could feel it. By the 4th day, David had developed a theory. The symbols weren't just mixed together randomly. They formed a kind of 3-dimensional code. The meaning shifted depending on which script you prioritized as your starting point. It was brilliant, actually. Whoever created this had found a way to encode multiple layers of meaning into a single inscription. You couldn't read it linearly, left to right or top to bottom. You had to read it in spirals, following the interaction between the different scripts. But knowing that didn't make the actual translation easier. David had to create an entirely new methodology for approaching the text. He developed a color coding system, marking each script type with highlighters. He created charts showing which symbols appeared in proximity to others. He cross-referenced everything with historical examples from his years of study. His neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Chen, knocked on his door on the 5th morning. David had been awake for 36 hours straight. When he opened the door, she took one look at him and her expression shifted from annoyance to concern. "Young man, are you all right? You look terrible." David ran a hand through his unwashed hair. He probably looked like he'd lost a fight with exhaustion. "I'm fine, just working on something important." "Important enough to make yourself sick?" She peered past him into his apartment, seeing the chaos inside. "When did you last eat a real meal?" He couldn't remember. "I'm really fine, Mrs. Chen, just a few more days." She disappeared and returned 10 minutes later with a container of soup and some bread. "Eat this, right now. I'm watching." She stood in his doorway with her arms crossed until he took several bites. Only then did she nod and leave, muttering something in Mandarin about foolish young people. The soup helped. It reminded David that he had a body that needed care. He forced himself to take a shower and change clothes. He ate the rest of the food Mrs. Chen had brought. Then he went back to work with slightly clearer eyes. Day 5 brought the real breakthrough. David was examining a cluster of symbols that had frustrated him for hours when he noticed something small, something everyone else had dismissed as decorative flourish, a tiny mark that appeared at regular intervals throughout the text. It looked like a simple line, easy to overlook. But David had seen something similar in an obscure academic paper about merchant codes from ancient Mesopotamia. What if that little line wasn't decorative? What if it was a key? A marker telling the reader how to approach the next section? He tested his theory, using the mark as a guide for which script to prioritize in each section. Suddenly, words started forming. Real words. Phrases that made sense. His heart was pounding so hard he thought it might burst out of his chest. The inscription was telling a story. It described a group of scholars from 3 different civilizations who had come together to preserve their combined knowledge. They'd created this hybrid writing system specifically so their wisdom could survive, even if all 3 cultures disappeared. The tablet itself was like a key to an entire library of knowledge that might still be buried at the excavation site. David worked through the night, translating section by section. Every new phrase confirmed his methodology. Every sentence proved that his interpretation was correct. By the time the sun rose on day 6, he had a complete translation. But translation wasn't enough. Dr. Wells had asked for methodology too. She needed to understand not just what the inscription said, but how David had figured it out. So he spent that entire day documenting everything, every step of his process, every connection he'd made, every reference source he'd used. He wrote it all out in clear, simple language, anticipating every question and criticism. By day 7, David had a 40-page document. The first section contained his complete translation. The second explained his methodology in painstaking detail. The third included supporting evidence from historical examples and academic sources. He'd checked it 17 times, looking for errors or weak points. He'd practiced explaining it out loud to himself, making sure he could defend every choice he'd made. His apartment looked like a tornado had hit it. There were coffee cups everywhere, papers scattered across every surface, and he was pretty sure he'd worn the same shirt for 3 days. But none of that mattered. In his hands, he held something that could change everything. David looked at the clock. It was almost midnight. In 9 hours, he had to present his findings to Dr. Wells. In 9 hours, he'd learn whether 15 years of invisible work had been building toward something real, or whether he was about to experience the most spectacular failure of his life. He tried to sleep but couldn't. His mind kept running through his presentation, checking his logic, preparing for questions. Finally, he gave up and just sat by his window, watching the city wake up as the sun rose. Today, one way or another, people would finally see him. The question was whether they'd see genius or just another nobody who'd aimed too high. David arrived at Dr. Wells's temporary office 15 minutes early. His hands were shaking so badly that he'd spilled coffee on his shirt during the train ride. He'd tried to clean it off in the bathroom, but there was still a faint stain near the collar. Great. He was about to present the most important work of his life while looking like he'd gotten dressed in the dark. The office was in a section of the museum he rarely visited. Everything up here was nicer than the basement, better lighting, newer furniture, windows that actually let in natural light. He sat in a chair outside the office, clutching his folder of documents, trying to steady his breathing. At exactly 9 o'clock, the door opened. But it wasn't just Dr. Wells. 3 other people filed out and looked at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed skepticism. David recognized 2 of them: Dr. Raymond Foster, head of ancient languages; Dr. Lisa Park, who specialized in archaeological linguistics. The third person he didn't know, but she wore the kind of confident expression that screamed senior academic. Dr. Wells appeared in the doorway. "David, come in. I've asked a few colleagues to join us. I hope you don't mind." Mind? His stomach felt like it was trying to escape through his throat, but he nodded and stood up, following them into the office. Someone had brought pastries and coffee, like this was a casual morning meeting instead of a moment that could destroy or define his entire life. They all settled into seats around a conference table. David sat at one end, facing 4 of the most accomplished researchers in the field. Dr. Wells's assistant was there too, setting up a laptop to take notes. The assistant caught David's eye and smirked slightly, like he was already looking forward to watching this crash and burn. "Whenever you're ready," Dr. Wells said. Her tone was neutral, professional, impossible to read. David opened his folder with trembling hands. He'd rehearsed this 100 times, but now every word he'd planned seemed to evaporate from his brain. He cleared his throat. "Thank you for this opportunity. I know my background is unconventional, and I appreciate you giving me a chance." He paused, then decided to just be honest. "I'm terrified right now, but I believe I've decoded the inscription, and I want to show you how." Something shifted in the room. Maybe it was his honesty. Maybe they'd expected him to come in acting overconfident. Dr. Park leaned forward slightly, her expression softening just a bit. David started explaining his methodology. He described how he'd initially tried the same approaches as everyone else and failed, how he'd almost given up. Then he explained the breakthrough, the realization that the 3 scripts weren't meant to be read separately, but as an integrated system. "Everyone has been treating this as 3 languages occupying the same space," David said, his confidence growing as he got into the material. "But I believe it's actually one language created by combining elements from 3 sources. Like if you took English, Spanish, and Mandarin and created something entirely new from their parts." Dr. Foster interrupted. "That's an interesting theory, but we have no historical precedent for such a complex hybrid system." David had expected this. "Actually, we do." He pulled out copies of academic papers, some of them decades old and obscure. There are at least 4 documented cases of cultures creating hybrid writing systems when they merge through trade or conquest. They're not well known because the examples are fragmentary, but the principle is established. He laid out the papers on the table. Dr. Foster picked one up, scanning it. His eyebrows rose slightly. "I haven't seen this research in years. How did you even know about it?" "I read a lot," David said simply. He continued his presentation, explaining the color-coding system he'd developed, the patterns he'd identified, and the crucial discovery of the key marker that everyone had dismissed as decorative. As he talked, he watched their faces. The skepticism was still there, but it was mixing with something else now. Interest, maybe even respect. Then he showed them his translation. He'd formatted it cleanly, with the original symbols on one side and his interpretation on the other. The inscription described a coalition of scholars from 3 ancient civilizations working together to preserve their knowledge for future generations. It was beautiful and historic, and exactly the kind of discovery that changed how people understood the past. Dr. Wells was silent, staring at the translation. Then she stood up abruptly, and David's heart nearly stopped. Was she angry? Had he gotten it completely wrong? The room went absolutely quiet. She walked to her laptop, pulled up files from the excavation, and started cross-referencing details. Her fingers moved quickly across the keyboard. Everyone waited. The assistant had stopped smirking. Dr. Foster was reading through David's methodology page by page. Dr. Park was examining the translation with intense focus. 5 minutes passed, then 10. David could hear his own heartbeat. Dr. Wells kept typing, comparing, checking. Finally, she turned around. There were anomalies at the excavation site, she said slowly. Things we couldn't explain. We found artifacts from 3 different cultures in the same chamber, but they were mixed in ways that didn't match any conquest or trade pattern we knew. We found what looked like a library structure but couldn't determine what it was for. She looked directly at David. Your translation explains all of it. The coalition you described, the preservation of knowledge, it accounts for everything we found but couldn't interpret. David's mouth went dry. Does that mean? It means it's correct. Dr. Wells's voice was quiet but firm. It's not just correct. It's brilliant. You didn't just decode an inscription, David. You've identified an entirely unknown form of scholarly cooperation between ancient civilizations. This changes our understanding of how knowledge was preserved and shared in the ancient world. Dr. Foster set down the methodology papers. I have to admit, when Dr. Wells told me about this meeting, I thought it was going to be a waste of time. An archivist with no formal training? He shook his head. I was wrong. This work is extraordinary. The methodology alone deserves publication. Dr. Park was nodding. The linguistic analysis is sophisticated. You've clearly spent years developing expertise in this area. Where did you study? I didn't, David said. I taught myself. In the basement after work. The room went silent again. Dr. Wells's assistant was staring at David like he was seeing him for the first time. Dr. Park looked stunned. Dr. Foster just shook his head in what looked like amazement or disbelief or both. You taught yourself, Dr. Wells said. All of this? David nodded. I've been working at the museum for 15 years. Nobody really paid attention to what I did down there, so I had a lot of time to study. Dr. Wells sat back down, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked genuinely surprised. David, do you understand what you've accomplished here? Most researchers with PhDs and decades of experience couldn't solve this. But you did it in a week. 7 days, the assistant said quietly. He did it in 7 days. Dr. Foster leaned across the table. I need to ask, what else have you been working on? What other research have you done that nobody knows about? David thought about his notebooks, the theories he'd developed, the connections he'd made between artifacts sitting in the basement. A lot, he said. I have years' worth of research, but nobody ever asked to see it. Dr. Wells was looking at him with an expression he'd never seen directed at him before. It was respect. Real, genuine respect. That's going to change, she said. I made you a promise. If you could decode this inscription, I would endorse your career. I'm a woman of my word. She stood up and extended her hand across the table. David, I want to co-author a paper with you about this discovery. Your name will be listed first, as primary researcher. I'm also going to recommend you for a position at any institution you choose, and I'd like to discuss the possibility of you joining my research team permanently. David stood up, his legs feeling weak. He shook her hand, barely believing this was real. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Dr. Park said, smiling, because Dr. Wells doesn't make offers like this to just anyone. As David left the office an hour later, his head was spinning. They'd spent the remaining time discussing publication, plans, next steps, and what other discoveries might be waiting at the excavation site. Dr. Wells had already started making calls to colleagues, and David had heard her describe him as one of the most talented researchers I've encountered in my career. He walked through the museum in a daze, past the exhibits he'd walked by 1,000 times, past the cafeteria where nobody saved him a seat, past the colleagues who'd looked through him for 15 years. Except now, a few people were staring at him. Word traveled fast in a place like this. When he reached the basement, Frank, the security guard, was waiting at the bottom of the stairs. The old man was grinning. Heard you did something pretty amazing upstairs. The paper was published 3 months later, and it hit the academic world like a thunderstorm. News outlets picked up the story almost immediately. Not just the discovery itself, but the story behind it. The self-taught archivist who'd spent 15 years in a basement ignored by everyone, who'd solved a puzzle that stumped the world's leading experts. People loved that narrative. It was the kind of underdog story that made headlines. David's phone didn't stop ringing for weeks. Universities he'd never even applied to were calling with job offers. Research institutions wanted him to consult on their most difficult cases. Graduate students emailed asking if he'd consider being their advisor. His inbox was flooded with interview requests from journalists, podcasters, and documentary filmmakers. It was overwhelming. Terrifying, actually. David had spent most of his adult life being invisible, and suddenly everyone wanted a piece of him. He didn't know how to handle the attention. He'd given one interview to a major newspaper and spent the entire time worried he'd say something stupid. But the article came out well. The journalist had captured his story with respect and accuracy, and the response was enormous. The most surreal moment came when he received an email from one of the universities that had rejected his application for graduate school 8 years earlier. They were offering him a full professorship. David stared at that email for 20 minutes, trying to decide if he should laugh or be angry. In the end, he just declined politely and moved on. Some opportunities came too late to mean anything. What mattered more was Dr. Wells's offer. She wanted him to join her research team permanently, working on discoveries from the excavation site and potentially traveling to the location itself. Real fieldwork, real collaboration with experts who actually valued what he brought to the table. He'd said yes immediately. His last day in the basement was strange. David had spent so many years in that small office that leaving felt both liberating and sad. He packed up his personal belongings, his books and notebooks and photographs. Frank helped him carry boxes to his car, making jokes about how David was too important now to carry his own stuff. "You gonna forget about us little people?" Frank asked, but he was smiling. "Never," David said, and meant it. "You were the only one who talked to me like a person down here." "That's because you are a person," Frank said simply. "More people should have noticed." On his way out, David ran into Patricia, his former supervisor. She'd barely spoken to him in 8 years, but now she stopped him in the hallway with a bright smile. "David, congratulations on everything. I always knew you had potential." He almost laughed at that blatant lie, but he just nodded politely. "Thank you, Patricia. You know, I was actually the one who recommended you for that archivist position years ago. I saw something in you." That definitely wasn't true. David had gotten the job because he was the only applicant, but he didn't call her out. What was the point? "I appreciate that," he said, and kept walking. The real changes took time to settle in. Dr. Wells didn't just endorse David's career, she actively mentored him. She taught him how to navigate academic politics, how to present at conferences, how to write grant proposals. She introduced him to colleagues around the world and made sure everyone knew his name. When people tried to dismiss his lack of formal credentials, she shut them down immediately. David has done more real research in 15 years than most PhDs accomplish in their entire careers, she told a room full of skeptical academics at one conference. "If you can't see his value, that says more about your limitations than his." David was standing at the back of that room when she said it, and he had to step outside for a moment, because his eyes were stinging with unexpected tears. Nobody had ever defended him like that. Nobody had ever believed in him that fiercely. 6 months after the paper's publication, David and Dr. Wells traveled to the excavation site together. It was his first time doing real field work, and he felt like a kid on the first day of school. Excited and nervous and completely out of his depth. But Dr. Wells was patient. She showed him the proper techniques, explained the process, and treated him like a colleague rather than a student. Using David's translation as a guide, they found what the inscription had promised. A hidden chamber containing hundreds of tablets, scrolls, and artifacts from the 3 ancient civilizations. It was exactly what the ancient scholars had described, a preserved library of combined knowledge. The discovery made international news. David's name was now permanently attached to one of the most significant archaeological finds of the decade. But success changed more than just David's career. It changed how he saw the world and how he saw himself. He'd spent so long believing that he wasn't good enough, that his lack of formal education made him less than others. Now he understood that knowledge and brilliance could come from anywhere, in any form. The basement hadn't been a prison. It had been his university, and he'd given himself an education that most institutions couldn't provide. A year after everything changed, David started a foundation. He called it the Overlooked Scholars Initiative. The goal was simple: find talented people who'd been ignored by traditional academic systems and give them the support they needed to succeed. He created scholarships for researchers without conventional backgrounds. He funded projects that mainstream institutions considered too risky. He made it his mission to seek out brilliance in unexpected places. The first recipient of his scholarship was a janitor at a community college who'd been teaching herself astrophysics using online lectures and library books. The second was a retired postal worker who'd developed a new approach to analyzing historical climate data. Both of them reminded David of himself, and he was determined to make sure their talents didn't waste away in obscurity the way his almost had. Dr. Wells became more than a mentor. She became a true friend. They co-authored 5 more papers together, and she insisted that David receive equal credit for all their collaborative work. When other researchers tried to sideline him or treat him as just her assistant, she made it clear that David was a full partner in their research. One evening over dinner at a conference in London, Dr. Wells brought up something that had been on her mind. "You know, David, I've been thinking about that day you volunteered to decode the inscription. I almost didn't let you try." David looked up from his food, surprised. "Really?" "My assistant was convinced I was wasting my time. Some of the senior researchers at the museum called me later to ask why I'd bothered with someone from the archives." She paused, swirling the wine in her glass. "I let you try because I thought everyone deserved a chance. But honestly, I didn't expect you to succeed. I thought you'd fail, and then at least I could say I'd given you a shot." "What changed?" David asked. "You did," she said. "When you presented your findings, I realized I'd spent my entire career making assumptions about who was capable of brilliance. I'd equated credentials with competence, prestige with potential." "Yo." David laughed, and it came out slightly hysterical. Yeah, I guess I did." "Always knew you were smarter than they gave you credit for," Frank said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Glad they finally figured it out." David sat down at his metal desk in the basement, surrounded by boxes that nobody wanted. Except now everything was different. He was different. Or maybe he'd always been this person, and the world had just finally decided to notice. His phone buzzed. An email from Dr. Wells. The subject line read, "Change of address needed." He opened it. She'd already submitted their paper to one of the most prestigious journals in the field. And she'd included a note at the bottom. "You won't be working in the basement much longer. Get ready. Your life is about to get very interesting." David looked around his small office one last time. 15 years he'd spent here, invisible and ignored, building himself into someone who knew things that experts didn't, waiting for a chance that he'd almost convinced himself would never come. The chance had come, and he'd proven that genius doesn't need permission to exist. It just needs someone willing to finally see it. "You taught me that I'd been looking in all the wrong places," she smiled. "You didn't just solve an impossible puzzle, David. You reminded me what it means to actually see people." David had to take a moment before responding. "You changed my life," he finally said. "If you hadn't given me that chance, I'd still be in the basement." "No," Dr. Wells said firmly. "You were always brilliant. I just gave you a platform. The genius was always yours." Years later, when David became the director of his own research institute, reporters often asked him about his journey. They wanted to know how it felt to go from nobody to somebody, from invisible to celebrated. David always gave them the same answer. "I was never a nobody," he'd say. "I was always exactly who I am now. The only thing that changed was that people finally decided to look." He'd talk about the importance of recognizing talent wherever it exists, not just in prestigious universities or published papers. He'd remind people that some of the greatest minds in history were self-taught, overlooked or dismissed by the institutions of their time. And he'd encourage anyone listening to never underestimate the person sorting files in the basement or mopping floors at night. Because brilliance doesn't announce itself with credentials. Sometimes it just sits quietly in the shadows, waiting for someone to turn on the light. David never forgot those 15 years of invisibility. He kept a photograph of his old basement office in his new university workspace as a reminder that he'd earned everything he'd achieved through patience, dedication, and countless lonely nights of study. A reminder that being overlooked doesn't mean being worthless. And most importantly, a reminder to always look closer at the people everyone else is looking through, because somewhere in the shadows there's always another person like he used to be, someone brilliant and capable and completely unseen. All they need is one person to give them a chance, one person to finally see what they've been all along. That was Dr. Wells's gift to David, and it became David's gift to everyone who came after him. Not just opportunity, but recognition. Not just a platform, but belief. In the end, that's what changed everything. Not the discovery, not the acclaim, not even the success. It was simply being seen by someone who mattered at a moment when it mattered most. And David made sure to spend the rest of his career doing exactly that for others. Because he knew better than anyone how much it meant to finally step out of the shadows and into the light.